That's right. The Ten Commandments are not Christian. That's right. I said it. And if you don't like it, you can turn this video off. But if you want to learn more, stick with me because I'm actually going somewhere today. Welcome to the desk of Dr. Dandridge, where we talk about and we tackle big questions. I love tackling big questions with regards to faith, history, and theology, and sometimes inside of a way that makes us think critically, because that's what I'm always about, but then also in ways that help us to look at the Bible, look at scripture, look at history in ways that we have not really thought about them. So today I have a question that might ruffle some feathers, and a question that's been brought to my attention quite a bit in teaching at Clark Atlanta University inside of my biblical heritage class, inside of my African American religious studies class, is this whole notion of the Ten Commandments and are they Christian? And the fact of the matter is that a lot of individuals, a lot of people utilize the Ten Commandments as this, we're going to talk about it, this moral code for humanity. And there are even some, political things around it having inside of our schools and whatnot. But we're really going to talk about it today is, are the Ten Commandments Christian? Because here's the thing, most of us are taught the Ten Commandments that they are the foundation of Christian morality. They're displayed inside of our churches, debated in courtrooms, and even referenced inside of, some pop culture as this divine standard of righteousness. But what if I told you that number one, Moses wasn't a Christian? What if I told you that the Ten Commandments weren't originally even given to Christians? And, here's where it gets more interesting. Y'all please don't tune out right here. But what if I told you that there were earlier moral codes that sound a lot like the Ten Commandments? Here's the thing I want to look at today. Could Moses have been influenced by Egyptian law? Specifically the precepts of Ma'at, because after all, Moses, the person who was believed to have been given the Ten Commandments by God, he was raised in Pharaoh's household, educated in the very heart of Egyptian culture. I know. It's going to be a wild ride, but here's the thing. Stick with me because I want us to really wrestle with this thing together, And of course, I want to hear from you too. Put it inside the comments. I already know I'm ruffling some feathers here as we go through this. Drop your comments. Let me know. Message me. Do you think that the Ten Commandments stand alone, or do they have like a deeper root than what we've been taught all of these years? All right. But let's start with the basics. Number one, Moses was not a Christian. Okay, now, like I said, we utilize the Ten Commandments as this, Christian moral code. But when we go back to the originality of the Ten Commandments and the person who received the Ten Commandments, Moses was not a Christian. Now, here's the thing. That might sound obvious, but it's important for us to begin inside of this place. Moses lived about 1,200 years before even Jesus came on the scene. Christianity didn't even exist. The Ten Commandments also weren't given to Christians. They were given to the Israelites as a part of God's covenant with them, with that specific group of people. We find them inside of the book of Exodus, the 20th chapter. After God delivers Israel out of Egypt, he makes this covenant with his people, and these commandments were the terms between God and God's chosen people. Now, here's the thing. At that time, they were not like they are today, this universal moral code for all of humanity, nor were they this distinctively Christian set of rules. And yet, many Christians today treat them as if they were divinely handed to the church. Why is that? And then also, I want us to think about, should Christians follow the Ten Commandments because it's God's law, or because they align with Christ's teachings? Because that's really how it came over inside the New Testament, because some believe that the Ten Commandments is a good display of what Jesus would have believed in, of what Christ would have believed in. So I want y'all to kind of think through me with this. But let's go back to the Egyptian connection. Because here's where things start to really get interesting about the Ten Commandments. Okay. Because Moses wasn't just some random guy plucked out of the wilderness. No, Moses was raised as Egyptian royalty. Inside of Exodus, the second chapter, in the 10th verse, it tells us that Pharaoh's daughter adopted Moses and raised him as her own son. That means that Moses grew up learning Egyptian law, learning Egyptian philosophy, and also learning Egyptian religion. You know, and in Egypt, there was already, even before, the Israelites came, there was already this well established moral code. And these were the 42 precepts of Ma'at, which is found in the text like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which you might have heard about. And here's where I really want us to lean in, because some of the precepts inside of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is much earlier than the Ten Commandments, are very, very similar to what we find inside of the Ten Commandments. For example, let me give you a couple of examples. The Egyptian Book of the Dead says, "I have not killed." Sounds familiar to "thou shalt not murder" in Exodus 20:13. It also says, "I have not stolen." "You shall not steal" in Exodus 20:15. "I have not committed adultery." "You shall not commit adultery" in Exodus 20:14. "I have not spoken lies." "You shall not bear false witness" inside of Exodus 20:16. So here's the big question. Did Moses take what he learned from Egyptian law and adapt it into the Ten Commandments? Now, I'm not saying that the Ten Commandments were a direct copy of Egyptian teaching. That's not what I'm saying. But let's just be honest. Moses didn't grow up inside of a vacuum. No, he was educated inside of Pharaoh's palace, and he knew Egyptian law better than he knew Hebrew tradition. So is it possible that when God gave Moses the commandments, his Egyptian upbringing shaped the way in which he wrote them? I want to hear your thoughts. Does this challenge how we see the Ten Commandments, or do you think that they're just, completely separate from human influence? Because one of the things that we learn over the course of time is that culture has a huge effect on how we interpret religious experiences. The culture of Moses' time, the culture of the civil rights movement, the culture of present day millennia, even the culture 20,000 years from now is not going to be the same. And oftentimes, one of the things that I love about God is that God typically likes to adjust to whatever culture is present in order to make God's self more relevant. So is it possible that even Moses's cultural influences inside of Egypt could have, caused him to transcribe the text inside of this very, very different way? I really want us to pause for a second, because I'm sure that a lot of you are kind of asking the question, but the Ten Commandments came from God. They weren't borrowed from Egyptian ideas. And something, you're right. You're right. The biblical account says that they were divinely given. But here's a tough truth. Divine laws often come through human culture. A lot of people think that I remember watching this out of the movie back in like the 70s or 80s, somewhere around there, where it showed God coming down and the scroll being here and God's finger writing on the scroll. It could have happened. None of us were there. It could not have happened. Moses could have literally taken his pen, went to the scroll, and heard from God, but then wrote in such a way that would have been present with the culture that he was in. And also wants to kind of think about this, because even Jesus did this inside of his teachings, inside of his preachings. Jesus used parables that made sense really to Jewish farmers and fishermen. I want you to think about it. If Jesus were walking around inside of today's culture, he would probably be making reference to, to Bitcoins and electric cars and whatnot. But no, inside of that time, when we look at the Jesus model and the Jesus text, a lot of his analogies, a lot of his cultural references were for farmers and fishermen, because essentially that was the culture of that time. Even think about Paul inside of the New Testament. He quoted a lot of Greek poets in order to connect with the Gentile audience. So if it happened in the days of Jesus, if it happened inside of the days of Paul, my question would be, why wouldn't God give Moses laws in a way that made sense to a people who had just come out of Egyptian culture? And why would he not give it to Moses in a way that he could understand it, seeing that Moses came out of being trained inside of Egyptian philosophy? Here's another layer to consider. I know we're kind of going deep today. The Ten Commandments are much shorter and more absolute than the Egyptian precepts. Now, the Egyptian laws inside of the book of Dead were more like personal affirmations. You know, I have not stolen, I have not murdered. Whereas the Ten Commandments are more direct. You know, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And this shift, particularly, could indicate that while the moral concepts may have been familiar to Moses, the way they were structured, how he structured them, was something new. Instead of it just being an affirmation, it truly did become a covenant between God and God's people, and not just, you know, these daily affirmations or these guidelines that one should or possibly could live by, you know? Now let's stir the pot even more. Let's stir it even more. Because if Moses was influenced by Egyptian law, does it weaken the divine authority of the Ten Commandments? Or does it show that God speaks through culture, using what people already understand to reveal his will? How does God even insert God's self inside of culture today? There are so many examples that I can go inside, you know, but I really want to see, I really want to hear from you. Like, do you believe that God attempts and does, not just attempts, but does connect God's self to the culture of the time in such a way that truly does connect with people? I just want to kind of think about that for a minute. So let's come back to the original question. Are the Ten Commandments Christian? Here's my take. No, they are not Christian. The Ten Commandments are not Christian. They are Jewish. They were given to Israel, not the church. They were part of an old covenant that, according to the New Testament, was fulfilled by Christ and in Christ. Inside of Matthew 22, verse 37 through 40, Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment. And guess what? He does not quote the Ten Commandments directly. No, he says, and love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, in reference to Deuteronomy 6 and 5. And then he also says, love your neighbor as yourself, in reference to Leviticus 19:18. Then he drops the bombshell and says, all the laws of the prophet hang on these two commandments. Now, here's the thing. Jesus wasn't throwing out the Ten Commandments. No. He was shifting the focus. Instead of these rigid rules, Jesus centered everything on love. So if you're a Christian, the real question is, do I follow the Ten Commandments, or am I living by the law of love that Jesus was really pushing us towards? So here's your challenge, your homework for the week, to say the least. I want you to read Exodus, the 20th chapter, and compare it to Matthew, the 22nd chapter, verses 37 through 40, and just kind of jot down, you know, come back and put it inside the comments. What do you notice? Think about this question. Are you following rules? If you are a Christ follower or a Christian, are you following rules, talking about the Ten Commandments? Or are you following love, talking about the message of Jesus? You know, and then, of course, drop me a message. Put something down inside the comments. Do you think Christians are bound by the Ten Commandments, or are they part of an old system that has already been fulfilled through Jesus? You know, this was a good one. This was also a tough one to kind of delve through, but that's what we do here. We dig deep, we ask those questions, and we grow inside of the process. So if this challenged you, do me a favor. Look, like, subscribe, share. Let this be a conversation starter for you. And let's keep wrestling with faith. Let's keep wrestling with history. Let's keep wrestling with truth together, okay? Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and then, of course, keep walking in grace. Peace and blessings.